let's look at part B. It is often stated that the problem of vicious cycle of poverty exists in developing economies. Explain what is the meaning, explain what this means and discuss how this problem could be solved. So what are the key terms in this question? The key term is vicious cycle of poverty, which is also called as poverty trap. Poverty trap. Okay. In developing economies, again, another keyword. Explain what this means and discuss how this problem might be solved. Now keep in mind, in this part we have two things. We have discussion and we have explanation. In the previous part we were asked to assess the question. There's a difference between assessing and explaining. Assessing means to look at the pros and the cons, meaning we explain a point and we think about what are the positive, what are the benefits, and we think about what are the negatives, what are the drawbacks. But when it comes to explanation, it doesn't have to be both. Explanation simply means to explain what a concept means, to say about a concept, or to make the examiner understand about the concept. You don't have to talk about the benefits and the drawback. That you could do if the question said assess, but the question says explain. And the question also says to discuss, meaning you have to discuss both sides of the argument. Do you think this is a problem? Do you think this is a problem, or do you think this is not a problem? And this is something important to keep in mind whenever you're asking a question, so that you know what to write. So to get knowledge marks, first of all, you'll have to define our words. And we would over here define a poverty trap. We would over here define developing economies, and that should give you some marks of knowledge. What about your application? Again, application and analysis are both hand in hand. To get L4 level of marks, you need to write your application such that your analysis can connect with that application. One example that comes to my mind could be, individuals living in developing economies, especially those under poverty. Those under poverty, we know that have very low income level jobs, meaning some of them might be, let's say that they are, for the sake of the argument, let's say that they are janitors. So this is part of my application. I'm trying to give an example of an individual or a situation where this trap might exist. So what do we see about janitors? We know that janitors don't have enough income, so they have low income, and this could be part of my analysis. And because of that low income, they have very low savings. And since they have very low savings, they are going to have very low investment. And since they have very low investment, let me see if my spelling is correct. Okay, since they have very low investment, of course they are going to have very low income. So you see that there is a cycle. This is called as a poverty cycle. Again, I'm connecting my application with my analysis. I'm speaking of a situation. If you want to use a graph to explain a situation, that is also fine. But if you want to use your own words to explain a topic, that is also completely fine, as long as it's a situation that is real and that is relatable. So I'm using my application and I'm connecting it with my analysis to help the examiner understand my point and to create depthness in my answer. I'm not just randomly giving an application and then just giving my analysis. For example, some students might say, what is poverty trap? They might say, for example, poverty trap might exist in XYZ situation, and then they might start talking about in detail about poverty traps and how the poverty trap might exist, which is good. But the problem is you're not connecting your application with your analysis, and therefore you might get L3 marks, but you won't get L4 marks. Another situation we can say, hey, another category of people that usually go through poverty trap are those who are illiterate. Let me just keep it in simple words. Uneducated people in the society. So they of course have very less education, so therefore they have very low income. And since they have, the reason they have very low income because they don't really have high paying level of jobs. Since they have low income, they have low saving, they have low investment, so they can't educate themselves, and if they can't educate themselves, they remain uneducated for generations. And this can again be another example of a poverty cycle. And in the uneducated category, you can take any example you want. You can talk about how orphans are treated in society, especially in developing countries, how Another example could be about refugees, since we have a refugee crisis right now as I'm recording the video. I mean, how refugees can end up in this poverty trap in developing countries. Again, you will notice I'm connecting everything to developing countries, because that is what the question is trying to ask. And then you would evaluate your answer, and there are lots of evaluation we make. For example, first of all, we are supposed to challenge our assumptions. What are the assumptions that we make in these arguments? Well, one assumption that we make is that how do you classify developing economies, right? How do you classify developing economies? Maybe the country might be developing in terms of its GDP, but maybe it might actually have a very high standard of living. We have countries around the world with relatively low GDP, but they do have high standards of living. You can talk about some countries where you have or you can even talk about some cities where you have very high sanitation level and you have very high education level, but the GDP might be low. So they might be technically under developing economy category, but in terms of education, they might actually be very high up. So there are assumptions that we make in this argument, and challenging those assumptions could give you your evaluation mark. Another thing that you need to get L4 level of evaluation is you need to have something unique. What can we have unique about these arguments? There are lots of things that you could think about. The first thing that comes to my mind is, when we think about poverty trap, we think that this is cyclical. We think that this is forever in the sense this can last through generations, duration, nothing can happen. Maybe that's not true. Maybe an individual, let's say the janitor decides to take a loan, and using that loan he decides to open a business, and let's say using that business he makes a lot of profit, and then if he can make a lot of profit, he can do a lot of investment, and technically he can come out of that poverty trap. And we know that a lot of low income families can access loans, government loans, or can access loan from or they can access micro loans, which are becoming more and more popular these days. And these micro loans given by most banks generally give micro loans these days. They can create a business, they can move out of this poverty cycle. And we think that uneducated people cannot get a good education because of low income. Well, that may not be true. Again, we know that around the world we have, in most countries we have a lot of free education online. As I'm recording, the YouTube is an example of that. You can get a lot of free education. There are lots of free courses online available, which can help people who are uneducated get more education, get more skills. And there are lots of community colleges are relatively cheap, and they can give you high level of education. Again, all of these things are unique, and if you can include them in your essays, you can get high evaluation point. And then of course you need to have a judgment. And if you have a good judgment, again, what is the question? The question is explain what is meant by poverty trap, which we did, and discuss how this problem might be solved. So we have discussed about poverty trap, and we have talked about situations how poverty trap can exist. In your judgment, in your evaluation, you can talk about some of the ways poverty traps can be fixed. So you can talk about some of the ways poverty traps can fix, its pros, whether the trap, whether you can possibly do it, and the cons of that theory. For example, you can say that the poverty traps may be removed if the government steps in and government spends money, or give transfer fees, or give transfer payments or unemployment benefits. There's so many things the governments can do to fix the problem. You can talk about some of the problems that might have, the government failure could be a problem, corruption could be a problem. There's so many problems that can exist. And you can talk about situations where the government can solve the problem, and you can also evaluate by asking yourself, how can the government not be able to solve, meaning the pros and the cons. And at the end, you can give your opinion. Do you think this problem can be solved? Do you think this problem cannot be solved? Do you think the policies that you have described in the question effective? Are they ineffective? What is your opinion? And if you can do that, you will get L4 level of marks. Again, to summarize it for you guys, my main purpose is to help you understand the thought process so that you can write good essays. You should always start, number one, with definitions. Define all the key terms in the question. Number 2, what does the question want? What does the question want? Meaning, what do the examiners want you to answer? Keep a very exact understanding of what the examiner wants you to answer. Do they want you to explain? Do they want you to analyze? Do they want you to describe? What do they want you to do? Number 3, you need to analyze or answer the question, and you need to answer the question and make sure that you're answering the question with logic, with chains of analysis, and connect everything with your application. Meaning, use your application, use the examples that you have given, or use examples in between to further solidify and create depthness in your analysis and depthness in your answer, so that the examiner understands what's going on. Imagine telling a story. You're trying to explain to someone about something. You're going to take examples in your explanation, and that's what analysis is all about. You're taking examples and you're using those examples to explain to the person what you're trying to convey. And then fourthly, you need to evaluate. And to get full marks in evaluation, there are 3 things that you must do. We need to challenge assumptions, we need to think about something unique, or we need to give a judgment. Generally, you do need to give a judgment. So keep these 3 acronyms in mind, AUJ. And if you can keep these 3 acronyms in mind, your evaluation is gonna become super simple. All you have to do is challenge assumptions, think about something unique, something special, something that is not obvious, and give a judgment. And if you can do all these three, you can get high level of L4 marks. Hopefully this video gives you an understanding of how you're supposed to answer essays. In the future videos, I'll go through a lot of other past papers and examples so that you guys have a very good understanding of what you're expected to write.